Hello, just a little disclaimer from Mike here on the Raw Rugby League podcast. As you can see from the title of the pod in the feed, it's about Parramatta. And we couldn't have possibly seen them sacking Brad Arthur the night before we released it. These things happen in the podcasting game. Now, we thought we'd leave it in the feed anyway because the discussion's really good. It gives a lot of insight into where Parramatta have been, where the game's been around them, where they might go in the future, and the challenges facing the club. So, coach or not, we continue on. Of course, you can feel smart and say, well, why know better than those dudes? Well, you do, because we didn't know Brad Arthur was going to get sacked. But enjoy the pod. Hopefully it gives some insight into the systematic problems that are going on at the Eels that have led to us reaching this point. Thanks. Bye. Hello and welcome to the Raw Rugby League podcast. I'm Mike Meehall Wood, and today we're heading back to the pit of despair. But this time we're leaving South Sydney behind and we're travelling west to Parramatta. Already deep in the pit is Elliot Richardson from the extended bench and Eyed Eel, and wriggling around there with him to keep my eel metaphor going is Mitch Clarke from the Cumberland Throw. Hello lads, how are you doing?
G'day, thanks for having me.
Good, Mike. Good to see you, mate.
Now, those people who listen to this podcast will know, Elliot, you were mentioned on the Rugby League Eye Test episode last week as someone who'd come in off the back fence on the state of Parramatta, but I'm going to try and hold you back. The Parramatta Eels, it's a sort of a strange year for you in that, you know, the come down from the 2022 Grand Final continues, the extended drought continues, and they're at a bit of a crossroads with the future of Brad Arthur, the sort of aging nature of the team. We've got loads of talking points, but I kind of want to start with where you thought this season would be at this point. Is because, you know, it's going pretty badly. We are recording this before Magic Round, so just so everybody knows, if they won 70-0 at the weekend, or it could be worse and they lost 70-0. But where did you see this going in the trajectory of where the sort of Brad Arthur era has been and potentially might not be in the future?
I mean, after last year, just the sheer volume of injuries, I thought we'd at least be 50-50 by this point of the season. I didn't expect us to suddenly pick up where we left off in 2022, but I knew we had a decent side. If you had asked me this after the first three rounds, I'd be saying the same thing, because the win against the Bulldogs was scrappy, but they eventually kind of kicked into gear, and they did get beaten by Penrith, but that was one of those weird games to watch, just having, Bailey Simonson knocked out in the first minute and then having to rejig the entire back line against the best attacking side in the competition really was always going to be difficult. But it showed, well, those handful of games start the season kind of had some positivity to start with, because it looked like they were set to definitely improve on last year, and didn't look like they lost too much either. But kind of as the season's gone on, my pessimism has very quickly grown and my optimism's dropped off a cliff. And as you did mention, we are before Magic Round. I think we've only won one game in Magic Round. That was against the Warriors in one of those shootouts, and the rest of them I think have been against Melbourne, who have towed us up each time. So I don't hold a lot of hope for this weekend.
We got beat by the lowly Titans last year, Elliot. I was sitting in the stands crying along with the rain at the same time. It was a disaster.
Did we drop a lead in that game?
No, they got out to an early lead and we never recovered. We came back, but then it went very, very close at the end. I think Gutho sort of exploded at full time just out of frustration. But it was just one of those down games. And I think that's the one that Brad Arthur at the end of last year said that's one of those games that we should have easily put away.
There's a few of those last year.
Yeah, I think he might have said in the sheds or in the presser afterwards, he goes, I just looked at the boys and said, how'd we lose that? But that to me sort of indicated 2023, which is why I was a bit more optimistic like you, Elliot, this year, getting our full complement of players back. And look, other than Mitch Moses, our injuries and, just recently Gutho, actually we've had pretty much our full squad on the paddock. It was tracking how I thought, like you said, after the first three rounds, but I don't know, maybe we look for excuses once Moses disappeared, and I think our football sort of indicated that a little bit.
Yeah, obviously, you field a lot of, through the Cumberland Throw, you see a pretty wide view of Parramatta fans who are pretty, obviously I deal with all sorts of fans on the internet, and Parramatta fans tend to be like they're not quite West Tigers levels of sort of doom scrolling, but the more that you kick the team, the more they they go, yeah, I know. Was that the feeling across the support that like it only takes a couple of weeks for the sort of old feelings to kick in, or was there a genuine optimism? I'm trying to think of the more long term, like having made the grand final, that euphoria, and then you see the next year kind of, there's a lot of excuses around injuries that you could pretty legitimately make, I would say, and the way that the season almost hinged on a game where suddenly players get called in for a needless Origin appearance. We were just talking off air about how annoying Origin can be in terms of the NRL season. And then this year, you kind of go, well, we signed everybody down to long-term deals, a couple of guys coming through. Like, that's got to be... Was optimism something that you were seeing, or was it more of a cautiousness?
No, I don't think so. I think Eels fans, well, the ones that I engage with in particular, are, for the most part, this is certainly not everyone, but for the most part, pretty fickle. That, depending on the last week's result is what determines what our future will look like. And I think that's pretty indicative coming into this season. I think like a lot of fans thought we're doomed. What are we doing here? Our recruitment, our retention, our coaching, our defence. Why do our wingers rush in? All of these things sort of coming out in abounds. And then it gets allayed with a pretty good first round, a gallant second round, as Elliot was touching on, and a good third round. And you think, okay, maybe that'll quiet down for a little bit, and maybe this is the team that we should have been in 2023. But, I think it just it gets exacerbated by the length since premiership, obviously, which is probably going to come up at some point, that people look for an opportunity to say, this is why we haven't won a premiership in so many years. And it's like, well, that happened in 1 minute of one game, but that is the key reason that people will point to. And just say that's the character of this club, or that's the undercurrent of who we are, that we don't have the toughness or the mental capacity to do this, and people will point to that. And it's an easy thing to point to because, to be honest, it's indefensible. Yeah, you're right. We haven't won a premiership in too long, and there's no real defense to that. I deliberately don't engage in banter online because it's the easiest reply in the world is, when was the last time your team won a premiership? So I think in the same way that fans are just too willing to point to that, and it makes us pretty susceptible to a couple of losses on the trot for all of those doomsdays.
Do you think, Elliot, we've bonded over this in the past, like the sort of style of play of Parramatta, very forward. I mean, Brad calls it the power game. That seems to be what's called. Lots of offloads. It's maybe it's worth explaining to people who aren't as obsessive about these things as we are, in terms of like how Parramatta play and sort of how kind of different it is to everybody else, because they're really they're the only team trying to still play like this, which would have been a very successful style of play when Brad Arthur developed it in a pre-6 again era, but kind of looks increasingly out of step. Yeah,
so Parramatta really rely on their big middles. You look at Parramatta's forward rotation, Junior Barlow, Regan Campbell-Gillard, currently Joe Afangawe, Jermaine Hopgood, Ryan Madison, we don't have injuries in the back row. Ryan Madison's in the middle. And then he cycles kind of through Luca Moretti or Wiramu Greg as well, Makahesi Makatoa. And you're right. When Brad developed this, and we're going back to 2014, 2015, this is the way the game was played. You look at some of those squads that he had back then. You think of Tim Manor, the end of Fuifui Moimoi's career, Danny Wicks for a season.
I'm stopping you for a minute here. Fuifui Moimoi was still playing for Rochdale Hornets, which
at the end of his NRL career.
The pinnacle of his career is playing for Rochdale Hornets.
He's still going. He's still going. He's 42 or something these days. 43, still terrifying defenders in the middle of the field for the 10 minutes of game time, I think, these days.
Sorry to interrupt you on that, but I will not have slights against Rochdale Hornets on this podcast. I can go and get my Rochdale Hornets jersey out.
But he's always kind of based it around that really forward power game, as you mentioned, and particularly before the new rules were brought in. It kind of worked to an extent, which is kind of weird saying that because that's literally what Cronulla won a premiership on, was an incredibly tough middle forwards, a defensive structure that was prepared to dare the referee into penalising them and then suffocating teams into submission. And if you look at the way Brad's kind of, even his halves, like he got rid of Chris Sando relatively quickly after coming in. I think Sando only lasted a season and a half. He's always kind of looked for that half that can try and get the ball downfield to give his forwards the chance to get downfield and put pressure on the opposition. But I actually think his game plan worked from 2020 to 2022 because if you've got slightly more possession than your opponents, but you've got a larger middle forward rotation, you're essentially just going to ram the ball down their throats. Warren Ryan's spoken about it in the past about you kicking the front door in. You don't need to go in through the side window. You're just going to bash the opposition into submission. But in playing that style of play, you very much leave yourself open to getting exhausted because you're relying on your forwards to not only run the ball in any part of the field, and we can get to this a little bit later, but you're also relying them then on to lead the line speed, which then becomes what gets preferenced as fatigue sets in, and how do you then rotate your middles? And I know we'll probably touch on it a bit later at how Brad's worked his interchange and the amount of minutes he's given to his big name players. But it's that focus on that. Brad spoke about front loading your effort. I hate hearing that. I don't want to hear it again. Another press conference about front loading effort or winning the collision, because rugby league is a collision-based sport. Every team's trying to win the collision, but some teams are a little more subtle with how they win that collision than others, and Parramatta is that other. If you go back to 2022 and you get the tail end of those teams trying to catch up to the 6 again rules, Parramatta's using, I think it was Nathan Brown was a bit of that season, but Ryan Madison really came into his own there as that ball-playing middle, like a lot of teams have, and we've got 2 of them in that Jermaine Opgood, Junior Barlow can tip the ball on, but their priority is really to carry the ball forward, put the opposition under pressure, and then look for points off the back of that. And you can only do that if you have more possession than your opponents. Otherwise, you're essentially pushing shit uphill because you're not getting the ball to make the meters that you need, which is not giving your playmakers the time and space that they need to execute. And in Parramatta style of play, where the halves are relatively wide to the ruck, you need that time and space. You don't really see Brown get that tight or Moses get that tight into first receiver because quite often you're relying on the forwards to move the ball. But if you're going nowhere, Penrith did it to them in the grand final. They kicked them to death and then pinned them up their own end for like 65 minutes of that game. And Parramatta had no answer. And teams have done that to them in the past. Or quite simply, you can like strip this all the way back. You just wait for Parramatta to start to implode. Like you start to look for them pushing the passes, you start to look for them making the errors under fatigue, and then you can exploit that because they start to lose control of the ball. Once it kind of drops by that 52% mark, then it becomes not easier for the opposition because Parramatta is still a very physical side. Teams don't want to run at their middles, but they found that if the middles are tired, they don't get up, they don't push out, they don't close the gate, and then the gaps open up on the edge of the field. And the game's moving away from that style of play, that keeping the ball in the middle. You even look at Canberra, who they are above Parramatta. They've been a bit hot and cold this season, but when they play good football, I put a video together the other week, they played some sets where they did not take a single run into Parramatta's the middle third of the field. They were either on the left tram line and then they would just shift the ball in one play to the right tram line. And they were just staying out of the middle of the field. Penrith did it to us as well. They found the weakness in that we had Kelma Tuolangi in the back line. They just targeted him. And Penrith did it to Brisbane the following week. And Brisbane did it to us as well when they had the opportunity to. And that has also kind of led to a reduction in points, that ability to threaten defenses, because they just know if you just compress Parramatta's middle, they don't want to move the ball outside that middle. That's their game plan. They stick to it. They do it very well when they're on. But teams also know that they're not going to get shredded on the edge then.
So I can sort of, to be the devil's advocate on this, right? Obviously, my NRL team is Manly. And when Parramatta beat Manly in round 3? I can never work out with the Vegas which round was what, but very early in the season.
Yeah.
Manly did exactly that, where they just passed it around, went the whole length of the field, scored, I think it was Garrick or Taboyevich scored an amazing try. And when they went, particularly to the right-hand side, they absolutely beasted Parramatta. And you could argue they should have won that game because of the Luca Moretti obstruction.
Well, they led 14-0 as well.
And and having led 14-0. And they basically, I'm still raging about this because they turned down a penalty goal and then didn't touch the ball for 25 minutes afterwards. And you saw that momentum swing. But this isn't the Manly podcast. But from the opposition fan, I was just watching that with my mates, like having a few beers, and I was like, it is so frustrating to play Parramatta because you know exactly what they're going to do and you can't stop it. Those offloads is like everyone is like a dagger to the heart. And obviously when it's your team doing it, you don't notice it. But when it's the other team doing it to you, you're like, these Yeah, it really gets to you. Mitch, do you find that, like, you know, Parramatta are very predictable? I think you can see how they're going to play, and yet you see very mixed results from it. Is it something that just as you sat there in the stands going, here we go again, sort of 30 minutes into the game, we've been going all right, and then we're just going to throw this away again? Or
there's a
what's
couple
the
of
emotional
things.
jersey like?
No, I think there's a couple of things. And look, Elliot touched on a lot of really good stuff about some of Parra's weaknesses. I think when we start to lose the middle battle, so it's the teams that choose to go through the middle, once we start losing that space behind the ruck, then it's opening up all over the field. I think our edges are always risky. And when we play teams like Manly, I don't know if you saw the Cowboys against the Titans in the last 20 minutes when they just went left to right, that sort of idea and that sort of attack terrifies Parramatta defences because we're so soft on those edges. If we start to then lose the middle as well, which we did against the Dolphins, we did against the Raiders, that's when it really opens up for Parramatta. So we assume that middle dominance and probably acknowledge an outside weakness. So they're the areas in defence. If we're not covering that ruck space, and if I can name names, Ryan Madison this year has been pretty poor at covering from marker and covering up that behind the ruck area. Once we start, Luca Moretti's been guilty of it a couple of times as well, not doing the job because of exhaustion. Sorry, say it again.
Once you got away with it when he was stood still.
But yeah.
Not that I'm bitter.
This is not a Manly podcast, Mike.
But at least a third of it is.
Tell Gerbo to run through the line next time.
That's absolutely
Gerbo, he broke that tackle. He'll take any tackle break he can.
When if we don't move that cover because we have that exhaustion that Elliot has touched on, we don't have the evidence when we're not controlling the ruck long enough to get our line speed back. Look, you've mentioned rugby league eye test a couple of times. He looked particularly at meters conceded, and something that wasn't touched on, I think, in that article, which is really key, is Parramatta loses control of the ruck. And once we lose control of that ruck, we can't stop the meters coming through the middle because we're not back on side in order to engage that attacking player. And I think once we lose that middle of the ruck, the edges are always risky, but once you lose the middle of the ruck, it's pretty much all over for Parramatta. I think you did touch on offloads as well. Something I think we've lost since 2022 is the long pass that you would just see it. It was a playbook. The offload would come and immediately a long pass would be the result. Reid Marnie was always there and always flew it out. We've gone away from that, but I really liked that strategy for Parramatta because it would create space in the middle, which would compress the defence, and then it would take advantage of potential space there on the edges. We don't do that anymore. And look, I'm not the world's biggest Reid Marnie admirer, but two things he did well was that long pass, getting the ball away from the ruck and led our line speed. And I think we're missing both of those replaceable, but nonetheless Reid Marnie elements in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I think there's also a bit of an intangible there you mentioned when we lose the ruck, we lose it completely. There's also no, and you actually see this in Penrith, there's no cunning middle defender who knows how to get himself tangled up in a ruck and very casually slide it. Isa Yeo is the expert at that. You watch him, Penrith start losing the ruck, Isa will get in, make sure he gets himself pinned, somewhere in the ruck where it looks like he's trying his best to get himself out, and he'll take as long as possible. And the referee's and I'm not saying this as I hate Penrith. This is just like incredibly smart rugby league play that, Cameron Smith used to do it. They just get themselves tangled up in the ruck. Aaron Woods does it whenever he plays in the NRL. It pisses me off so much because you can see what he's doing. He does it anyway. It's that ability to slow the ruck without giving away a 6 again or a penalty. Some cases, like the Roosters, they'll do it deliberately, give away the 6 again, just go, we'll defend you out of this. That's not a problem to us. We either can't defend the penalty or 6 again conceded, or we have no one who even attempts it. It's just get in, and I can hear it in the sports here when at the game, and it's like get in, and then bang, we get straight out, and either we've got a guy on the floor, or we've got one marker, or we've got no markers. And Jeremy Marshall-King, who has always been a solid NRL hooker, we made him look like prime Damien Cook. Honestly, I know he's been in good form this season, but our ruck defense was that poor that hell, you could have wheeled out Brad Drew and he would have looked $1 million against that type of side.
You could have wheeled out
exacerbated, no doubt, by
his son who's playing in the A-League. So
yeah, you could have enrolled him on from Western United.
And no doubt exacerbated by the Darwin heat, Elliot, that impact of having that middle. Whoever got exhausted first was going to lose that game, and Parramatta got exhausted and then exhausted some. And it just absolutely fell apart.
You know, there's one image that always sticks in my head, right, which will move us on to my... I've literally wrote, this is my favourite Parra subject in the running order. But I don't know if you remember, they lost to Cronulla at the start of last year, and everyone had been raving about how good Jermaine Hopgood was, but he got run past around the ruck by, I'm going to say it was Will Kennedy, but forgive me, Cronulla fans, if it wasn't Will Kennedy. And it wasn't that he was a bad player or that he missed tackles, because it actually, this was when he just come into the NRL, and he was pretty, wet around the gills still, but he had played brilliantly, and he was 39 minutes in the first half, and he was absolutely knackered. And I said, I can't remember who I was sat next to, but another journalist, I was like, he should have been took off 5 minutes ago because he's tired. And this was the ongoing theme of the Parramatta Eels, which, as Rugby League Eye Test data has proven since they now last to about the 55th to 60th minute before they completely collapses, where they previously, last year, they got to about the 35th and would, go into race into a lead and then completely throw it away. And at the heart of that was Brad Arthur's substitutes. Now, at the end of this year, the end of last year, the start of this year, I thought, because of the injuries, we saw Wiremu Greg play more, we saw Luca Moretti play more, Joe Afengawi played more, and I thought, he now knows that these guys can play it. Because my previous assumption was he didn't trust Wiremu Greg. But then suddenly, RCG got injured and Wiremu Greg played and he was actually fine. So I thought, well, here we go. They're going to play this same style, but they're actually going to trust it for 80 minutes. And it just hasn't happened again. And I wonder, is that age? Is that the Brad still messes around with his interchanges? I mean, Elliot, I know you're obsessive of his substitution plans, but
Elliot, I'll let you jump on that. But just to jump on Jermaine Hopgood, the week prior, it was admittedly the 85th or 89th minute, but he was the one who Harry Grant ran around as well. He was absolutely brilliant. And that was in round one, Golden Point against Melbourne, if I remember correctly, Elliot.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah,
and then round two.
Round one was. Yeah, I think round one was at Penrith.
It was Penrith at Parramatta.
We played Penrith. It went to extra time. Golden Point. Mitch won that game. Then we played Melbourne and went to extra time. And that was the Harry Grant.
We started none and four.
Other way around.
We started none and four.
Yeah. It was game one was Harry Grant and Golden Point. Definitely.
Yeah. And then Cronulla, we were leading. Gutho had a HIA and it all just fell apart. Probably a coincidence, but nonetheless, that's when it did. Anyway, the point was, it happened not just in that game, it happened on and on and on. And there were bench players playing 0 minutes, bench players playing 6 minutes in a very fast condition. And Junior Barlow and RCG are up there with 55, 65 minutes. Anyway, Elliot, question was for you.
Yeah. Oh, look, Mike, we've had this chat many times, both in the press box and on Twitter and the like. It's really weird the way Brad's previously used his interchange, as Mitch just mentioned. So I think I was looking at it towards the end of last year, and Junior was averaging something like 53 or 54 minutes a game. And in 2022, he was averaging 45 minutes a game. So you've got almost a 10-minute increase on his minutes, but he's a year older, and then he loses his starting partner in Regan Campbell-Gillard. So I can kind of half see Brad's gone, I've lost half of my starting pack, both origin level forwards. I'm going to have to play the other guy a bit longer. And Wiremu, as much as I like him, and I love it when he's on the bench, he also doesn't quite have the fitness. I think the longest he's played in one stint is like 21 or 22 minutes. But touching on what you mentioned there with Jermaine Hopgood, is you've seen it again this year, but like off and on. So at the end of last year, and I actually wrote before the game, I wondered if Brad will do this, was he's been starting Junior on the bench, Joe Afengawi to start, RCG and Jermaine at lock. And for me, that was giving a better balance. And he started again against the Bulldogs, started this year, same bench rotation. And he was giving Junior about 40, 45 minutes a game. And then the longer the season's gone, the more and more minutes Junior has been getting. And the fewer bench minutes that have been needed out unless injury is struck and we need to play someone for longer. And I think that's a huge part of the side struggling when they start to lose the middle, is that you've got two middle forwards who are both around 30 that have both probably played on their rugby league eye tests. It's said they're probably past their physical and performance peaks. So they're going to start tapering off just physiologically, probably on a slow decline. But then also this reticence to both rest Hopgood and Joey Lussick. Hopgood at least has had a bit of a rotation with Ryan Madison, but Brad keeps persisting with this 80-minute hooker idea, which almost no team that is worth their weight is doing this season. When they're fit, the Roosters will roll with 2 hookers. When available, the Storm will roll with 2 hookers. Brisbane roll with 2 hookers. They're looking to try and give their small guy in the middle a rest. And Joey Lussick a couple of times this season, I know people have been very frustrated going, it's a bad pass and dummy half. And you look at the minute and it's like, well, he's played 38 minutes straight and he's done 30 tackles and he's been everywhere because that's what Brad asks of his hooker. But he's got Brendan Hands catching a cold on the bench or sitting at 18th man. And there's none of that kind of rotation that we saw at the start of the year or at the end of the year. I'm not sure why he's not doing it, because like you, I thought maybe he doesn't trust Wiramu or Luca to come on and do their job. But last year, he actually praised Wiramu in a couple of press conferences saying, look, we weren't sure if he was going to play these many minutes, but he came out there, he did it, he did a good job, he did what we asked him to do. And then I know he's had a couple of injuries this year, but he's kind of dropped down the pecking order again. He's playing Cup. Makasi Makatoa has been recalled after getting sent to Cup at the end of last year. And Mitch mentioned this as well. You had guys throughout the past few seasons playing 0 minutes. I think at one stage, Jake Arthur got 90 seconds in a game, which now, Mike, I know you're an EPL fan, which is usually handed to someone who just needs an appearance. Maybe they've got a bonus clause in their contract. This is the NRL. That doesn't exist as far as I'm aware. Or it's for the older guys who need to be able to reach 10 games or something to qualify for some payment. But playing a guy for 90 seconds just doesn't cut it. And I think there were a few games last year where, I think it was the Melbourne game, where it was, I think it might have been Jake or it might have been Tom Opacek or something, sat on the bench into Golden Point, and we rolled with 16 guys, and Melbourne's just, they've done all their usual changes. And then there's no surprise that your middle falls to pieces because you refuse to actually trust the younger guys to do their job. Or there's almost like this sunken cost fallacies. I know Brad's mentioned their pay packets a couple of times at press conferences, that he pays Reg and Junior the big dollars so they play the big minutes. And it's like, well, if you reduce their minutes, what's the cost benefit there? What's your analysis? Are they going to still punch out big meters? They're going to make their tackles? Is their tackle efficiency going to be higher than if you keep them on the field that extra 5-10 minutes? Because
it's the law of diminishing returns is very, very true about prop forwards. And
when you're at a game, you can see a lot better on TV when you start to notice teams tiring, like the guys that can't clear the ruck quite as quickly, that can't quite close the gate as quickly. And I'll sit next to my dad and just go, Reg is cooked. And 5 minutes later, there's a guy who's gone straight past him. It's like, yeah, because he can't lift his legs up anymore. If I can see it, the opposition can see it, and the coaching staff can see it. But then there still is hesitancy not to. It's almost, and I know that there's this idea that there's an interchange plan, but there's a plan to the extent of we're going to take this player off of this player. I'd spoken, I think David Fairley, when he was coaching at Parramatta a long time ago, actually explained that it's kind of like we just judge it based on the feeling of the game, really. We know who's going to come on for who, but we don't really know when. Sometimes it feels like Brad's waiting until a specific minute to make a change because you can almost time it to the clock. 25 minutes is gone. Joe Offengow is coming off, and sure enough, Junior's got the card and he's coming on, but almost regardless of what's occurred during the game. And then it's kind of as the game goes on, you can start noticing when certain players, like you can watch Joey Lussick, and sometimes he can't even make it to dummy half by third or fourth tackle. He's buggered. But either there's no backup hooker on the bench or Brendan Hands is catching a cold, sitting on the sideline. So obviously, I've got a lot to say about this.
Well, as someone who sits in those press conferences with him, like I've asked him more times than I can remember about it, and people send you tweets going, "God, that guy asking about the subs again." But you ask about it because it doesn't change, right? And I guess that's obviously Brad's been in his position for a long time, so he's built this roster and he's overseen changes in this roster. And I guess this moves us on I was going to talk about the outside backs, but just while we're on it, I think it's worth going into the age profile now, because this is something that is, we spoke about it on the episode we did about Souths, but it's way out of whack. Like, I've written it down in the running order here, but you've got RCG, Barlow, Seawater are all 30. Moses, Matteson, Gutherson, Cartwright, and Sean Lane will all turn 30 this year. Like, that's basically all your best earners. So as of the start of next year, other than Zach Lomax, Dylan Brown, and Will Penasini, so there's 3 guys who'll be sort of, I'm not quite sure how old Lomax is, but I think he's 25 off the top of my head, or 24.
24, 25.
So Penasini, Brown, and they'll be under 25, and then there's basically nobody until you get to the 30-year-olds. I think Gawi's going to turn 30 as well. Like, that is a big gap in your team, and it looks like one that was meant to peak in 2022. And everyone's at 28, 29, brilliant. You're going to be 3 years on from that start of the 2025 season. You think, oh dear, and especially with forwards where you've guys like RCG and Barlow have been running to the ground, playing more minutes than they probably should have been doing, and suddenly you go, oh, actually, we don't really have anyone. Is that something, Mitch, that when you look at it and you go, like, this is kind of a catastrophe happening in front of our eyes, that you look at what's happened to South Sydney this year, for example, where a lot of players have got old overnight, and you think that would be the worry about Parramatta?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something Elliot probably hinted at but didn't touch on explicitly is that we also compound this by having 80-minute edge back rowers too. And so when you're putting more minutes into their legs as well, and as you just touched on, they're 30. I imagine that there was a plan in place, and the younger players that were coming through, like Luca and Wiramu, were part of that plan going forward. I can't help but notice that, the roster's old, but we haven't filled out our top 30 for the last, Elliot, tell me if I'm wrong, 3 or 4 years.
I think that's about 3 years.
We're running around with 26, 27, 25 players in a top 30, and the others are just relatively blank. So I think that, again, compounds because you don't have options to run. So you end up having players who probably are great New South Wales Cup players, but maybe not NRL players, sitting on the end of the bench. And you can understand Brad Arthur looking at another 5 minutes of Junior Barlow or 5 minutes of this bloke that he maybe doesn't trust or doesn't know particularly well, or is running around with injuries or whatever it might be that we're not aware of behind the scenes. And it, again, compounds the issue. And it just, you're right to ask the question, because, look, I understand, the coaching staff are sitting with all the information that we can just observe from the TV and from the stands. But at the end of the day, it's absolutely worth the question, because you just wonder why we continue to persist with exhausted players. And particularly when they're all sort of reaching that. Look, Moses or Gutho's age doesn't particularly concern me. It's the people who are in that forward pack. Maddo and Lane looking very, very tired this year. Sivo has looked tired for a couple of years. Again, other teams can make up for this because they get those meters from their outside backs, and Parramatta's not one of those teams either. We'll get to outside backs, I imagine, but yeah, it absolutely is concerning, and I'd like to figure out where to from here. What's 2025, what's 2026 going to look like when we roll out that top 17? Look, you're hoping it's got Blaze Talangi, Dylan Brown, Penasini, Moses probably still kicking around at that stage, Gutho, Lomax, but there's a lot of names in a 17, and you wonder what it's going to look like then. Yeah,
I think you just briefly touched on it there, but it is worth mentioning that, like, I'm sure we're all sad enough to watch New South Wales Cup, and like, if you watch Parramatta's New South Wales Cup team, like, there's a lot of Zach Sini, kind of Samuel Loizu, like these guys. You think Isaac Loizu, like these guys where you think, like, if they were going to come through, they probably would have come through by now. Like, and they're just sort of. I mean, I love Jordan Rankin, played for Paul FC, did great player in Super League, like pretty champion bloke by all accounts. But like the idea that he played so long in New South Wales Cup without ever looking like he was going to be in the NRL team, that's sort of a heart and soul of the New South Wales Cup team. You think, wouldn't that position be better filled by somebody else? Like there's and then the funny thing is, you're going to see like likely Talagi and Sanders, who look like pretty great talents even at that level, are in two positions where you actually don't need anybody and might theoretically not get a game, and end up that your best two players to come in that system are going to leave because they're in positions that you already have. Whereas, God, if there was a Ethan Sanders standard player playing prop, he'd probably be playing from he'd probably be playing NRL right now.
There is a young bloke coming through, which is Sam Tuivasa, but I think
Sam Tuivasa.
Yeah, he's probably a bit too young for the NRL right now. I know you did mention Jordan Rankin. I did actually have a chat to him when he first kind of came back to Australia and joined Parramatta. And from what I understood, the plan was he was like the break glass in case of emergency option, particularly after they had Brock Lamb and then Brock Lamb retired. So they'd bought that kind of NRL/Cup young backup half, and then he promptly retired after like a preseason or something. And then they'd had Jake Arthur come through, and then followed by Ethan Sanders, and I think Josh Lynn as well now as the 5'8" there. When Dejan Arce is in reserve grade. But you're right, like there's almost all this effort being put into, or not effort, but kind of talent identification in positions we almost don't really not need. Like we do need a backup fullback, and that's become patently obvious given the state of Gutho's knees. But in terms of a backup half, like you said, Brown's 24, Moses turns 30. In the scheme of halves players, they're not old. You're seeing Adam Reynolds play almost lights out football at the age of 35, 36, Daly Cherry Evans, 33, 34. The way that halves can adapt to the game is a lot different to the way middle forwards and outside backs can adapt, because for the middles, it's that energy, power that they, you start to see a drop off being able to play the big minutes with the big carries. And for the outside backs, it's the speed that goes first. And they've got to find a way to deal with it. Otherwise they end up out of the NRL. But we do have two young guys, which unfortunately are both ACL injuries gone this year, in Arthur Miller-Stevens, who made his NRL debut last year, and Richard Penasini, Will's younger brother. They would have been playing Cup this year if they didn't do their ACLs in preseason. But I have no idea what's actually going on at that development level, because, as you mentioned, Zach Steeney's still hanging around, and he wasn't good enough to play for the Tigers. Like the Wood and Spoon winning Tigers, they couldn't find a spot for him. They said, "No, you're no good here," but we've picked him up. And Isaac Lumi is, he makes, like, I thought Micah was bad, and then I watched him play.
He's a defensive bushfire. I actually think our positions probably 1 through 7, and I know that we are a bit soft in outside backs this year, but 2025's 1 through 7, I actually think we should be almost afforded.
They're not the problem.
No, that's not the problem at all. Particularly now we've plugged Lomax in. I think that was almost the perfect signing for Parramatta. I have no concerns 1 through 7, but it's the numbers from beyond there. Look, Matt Arthur will be a very, very good player, and I hope people don't respond to him based on his last name and the atrocious way in which a lot of the Parramatta fan base treated Jake Arthur. They're different players. Jake Arthur was treated incredibly poorly, and Matt Arthur is a completely different player as well. I think he is an absolute talent coming forward. Charlie Geimer, I think, will stay with Parramatta for quite a while as well. He's a real talent. We have that SG Ball premiership winning side, which is probably a year away from us really starting to see the fruits of the labour. Obviously, Blaze has come through a little bit sooner than that, Ethan Sanders as well. But we're probably a year away from really having that succession plan lined up. And other than Sam Tuivasa, and Charlie Geimer, as I mentioned, look, there's a lot of gaps that we need to fill for all of those 30-year-old players we mentioned earlier.
So I guess this brings us on to sort of the big question of the evening, which is that Brad Arthur's got a year left on his contract. If you listen to the rumour mill, you sort of read reports, this is something which is very much a live concern given Wayne Bennett's availability, given that there is this sort of year gap till the next team comes in. We think this is either going to be now, which doesn't look like it's going to happen this season, in which case you go, okay, so do we then start the cycle almost like what Canberra have done, where they've seen their 2019 generation go out and they're almost admitting that it's now going to go back up with, admittedly with the same coach there, but it's very much a piss or get off the pot as far as Parramatta is concerned in terms of what. Because if you're going to go with Brad Arthur for next year, then you might as well go with him for the year after and continue. And I'm sort of wondering what the general feeling is. He's been there for longer than anybody else in the NRL other than Ricky Stewart. I think he's coached more games than Brian Smith now, which would make him almost the most in Parramatta history.
He is the most capped Parramatta coach in history.
Yeah. So it's a big move, given that he's built this entire roster. By all accounts, they seem to love him. Like, I don't think any of the players have ever had any friction with him at all. Like, I've never heard anybody even whisper that they didn't like Brad. And when they lose and there's a bit of pressure on him, you can see what it means to guys like Gutho, for example, who really care about Brad Arthur.
Regan Campbell said he'd die for Brad Arthur, I think, earlier this
year. And you don't get that in every club. Like, that's not, it's not, I don't think it's empty rhetoric. Like, so where is the feeling that in terms of what can happen with this team going forwards? Because, we like to take the longest lens possible on this podcast. So, Mitch, I'm interested to, like, what can be done here? Because it's either you say, Brad, you've got it for another 3 years, bring this next generation through, or you go, okay, this is thanks for all your work, and somebody else gets a crack at it.
Yeah, look, I think Brad's always been pretty open when people have asked him if he believes he's no longer the right person, then he'll happily move himself on. I know he's come from Parramatta stock and he's obviously a proud, Parramatta family, but I still think Brad Arthur is not the problem. I still think it's the way in which the team has been put together. Now, I'll hear people already saying, well, it's the coach's team. He puts it together. He structures the roster. Look, I think every coach in the NRL would need to look at, and there'll be different opinions on how different coaches respond to strategies and substitutions and how many minutes their teams play and which teams are selected. But look, I'd like to think that there are still too few a coach better positioned than Brad Arthur to take Parramatta forward. But 2024 is not our best showing of who we can be. Elliot, I'm going to suggest that you disagree with my assessment.
Well, I'm going to butt in because here's my sort of question for Elliot was on that note, is that if we accept that Brad Arthur has always basically played the same way, there's no suggestion that he's going to change the way that he plays. And I guess from a tactical perspective, Elliot, is that is a good style from when he was the coach in 2014. It is not a good style now. Is that kind of where, I wonder what your take on that is in terms of general, the coach picks the tactics as well as the roster.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Mitch in terms of the way that a roster is put together is not all the doing of the head coach, because it's not. We know Mark O'Neill's the head of football at Parramatta and probably should be looked at a little bit in terms of how the squad's being put together since kind of 2021. He got some really good runs on the board there with Isaiah Papali'i, Bryce Cartwright, Regan Campbell-Gillard, Junior Barlow, like getting those players into the club. But since then, past couple of seasons, recruitment's really been off kind of until the Zach Lomax signing. In terms of Brad, so my concern is kind of what you say is that the tactics haven't changed, and kind of when he has evolved the side a little bit, it's taken a long time to get there, and it's taken a long time for anyone to kind of notice it. And I understand changing the way that your defensive structures work mid-season just doesn't happen. You don't see sides suddenly become defensive powerhouses mid-season. That's something that's going to be worked on. But our attacking structures, my big concern is they are heavily, heavily reliant on Mitchell Moses and Dylan Brown being Mitchell Moses and Dylan Brown. You can't take them out of that attacking structure and put two new guys in and have them play the same way. Whereas, and I am going to mention Penrith because Penrith's system is like dead set amazing, but the fact that they had Cleary miss huge chunks of seasons with shoulder injuries and hamstring injuries, and get a guy like Brad Schneider who's come back from the Super League, or bring a guy up in terms of like Jack Cogger, who ended up kind of being the anchor in the grand final after Jerome Luai went off, and find out that their structure, the way that they organize their attacking sets, is much better suited to kind of like this all-round attacking style. I know you mentioned offloads earlier, and I think a big part of it is that your offloads are fantastic when you have the players to take advantage of those offloads. As Mitch mentioned, Reed Marnie, perfect hooker for that situation. Gets the ball, flings it wide, you can attack the space. The current hookers that we've got, I'm not sure if it's they don't like to attack that way, if Brad's preferring the ball to stay in the middle. I don't know what that discussion is. But then you move those players out of the tactical structure that Brad had built, and it starts to fall apart. You move a couple of key players, and obviously your halfback is your most important player, but you take them out of it, and where does it leave you? It leaves us going side to side, despite sitting in the opponent's half for like 60% of a game. There are times you can see Like, I almost lost count of how many times Talangi got laid out by a Broncos outside back because they read what was happening before Parramatta had got the ball out of the ruck, because they could see it coming and there was no deception involved whatsoever. It was first receiver out the back, here, Talangi, catch this or get buried. And he got buried. Brown got buried. That's more my concern is over that tactical evolution, is that there hasn't been really one at Parramatta for the past couple of seasons. I can think you can kind of go three ways. You can kind of go, okay, Brad, this is your side for the next 3 years. Bring through the next group. We'll see what you can do with them. The other one is, we want to win a comp. We want to win it now. Wayne Bennett's available. Let's go get him. And then the third option is, Brad, you've been around a long time, but we don't think you're the right person to bring in this next crop. And you go look for, I know, Mike, you've mentioned McNamara from over in England with that bit of experience there, an experienced first grade coach just in a different competition. Or you can look closer to home and look at a John Morris, who did quite a good job at Cronulla and then got shafted. And admittedly, Craig Fitzgibbons turned into quite a good coach. But again, another coach with first grade experience. And you go, that's kind of your long-term project option there is John Morris or another experienced NRL coach. I mean, I'm in the business of, I would like to see a premiership before my kids get to high school. And for those who are unaware, I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I have never seen a premiership. I'm not that old. And if Wayne Bennett was available and was willing to come to Parramatta, I'd take him in a heartbeat purely because I'm selfish. And I understand it probably not long-term is going to be good if you've seen what's happened at St. George or at Newcastle. But in saying that, I'd just like a premiership at some point. And in saying that as well, you look at the Dolphins and they keep losing players. Like we mentioned earlier, they hammered us in Darwin. You can talk about the conditions, but the way they have played this season, Wayne's got a similar problem to what Brad Arthur's got, in that he's got some really aging middle forwards there, like the Bromwich brothers and Kafusi. You know, and he's taken Jeremy Marshall-King, who was an off-cast at the Bulldogs, not really a 5'8", not really a halfback, kind of maybe a hooker, had played, I think, a little bit of centre as well, and turned him into, I'm pretty sure would be involved in a Kiwi squad if they had a mid-season test right now. And then you look at some of the young guys the Dolphins have brought through as well, like Max Plath. And I know they've also managed to purchase Herbie Farmworth. But then you got an older experienced guy like Trey Fuller comes in, looks like he's played NRL his entire life, just as the confidence to go about things. And there is a certain intangible, very attractive part there of Wayne Bennett in that he tends to be able to turn up at a club, knows how to get the players on side. For me, that's almost your safe option, really. I mean, you're taking a big gamble if you keep Brad around for another 3 years after what will be 2023 and 2024. It's another gamble to bring in another coach without the pedigree of Wayne Bennett if Wayne Bennett's on the market. But if you bring Wayne Bennett in from like a whole of club perspective, you've gone, we have done the biggest thing you can do in the NRL, and that is bring in the most successful coach in premiership history. And that's kind of a, well, you can't be pissed off at us kind of decision there. Is if you told any club in the NRL, probably aside from Penrith and Melbourne, maybe the Roosters, Wayne Bennett will coach your side next year, you're probably not going to have a single person go, I don't want Wayne. Almost anyone will take Wayne.
Well, so here's my sort of counter argument to it, right? As I say, as a Manly supporter, we have basically just done this, where we deliberately ditched Des Hasler, who is, a very specific style of football, only ever really associated with Manly, the club, like did all of his best work at Manly, local legend here on the Northern Beaches, and basically you would have thought Des Hasler at Manly is essentially job for life areas if things hadn't gone wrong, basically, which were very little to do with the way that he played rugby league.
Yeah.
And gone, we are going to replace him with Andy Seibold, who is a project coach who has a very specific style of football. Could work like he did at South, could go horribly wrong like he did at Brisbane. But, we are going to lean in. We're going to get these players who play this style of football, and make it so that we, suit the coach that we have, and we're going to believe in the project. Whether this will work or not, we don't know. But you can go and look at all the statistics and tell you that Manly do something that nobody else is doing. Does it work? Similar. I don't think we're a better team than Parramatta, put it that way, in terms of the actual results over the course of the year, I would imagine would end up almost exactly what
they're very, very similar sides in kind of the way that they ebb and flow during games and during the
exactly.
season.
Yeah, can't control the game, and maybe that'll get better. I don't know, but Manly have clearly gone. We are going project coach. This is going to be year one. We've got Daly Cherry Evans, who's going to be got 3 years in his contract, and year one was last year. Year two is this year, and then next year is going to be like the big tilt. We've got all these guys, and that'll be if Daly's going to win it, that's when he's going to win it, And if not, we go on to the next guy. So I think you've got that now where you can say, right, okay, we can look at this roster that we have, and we can look at Mitch Moses, for example, and do something similar where we say, if we settle now, we're going to have X. By the time we win the Premiership in 2026, we're going to have Matt Arthur's going to be playing 9. We're going to have, X, Y, and Z is going to be playing everywhere. And it probably means that we're not going to have RCG and Junior Barlow, or we might have them, but in a more sort of the Jared Warrior-Hargreaves role as experienced guys in the middle, kind of like what Manly have with Lodge and Nathan Brown and those sort of older guys kind of doing a different job, but they're not the main guys like Paseka and Tebojevic are. And if you do that, then now you say, okay, we go and get Sean Wayne, or we go and get Steve McNamara, or John Morris, or, that kind of idea of a coach where it's going to be a 3-year project. We're really going to buy into it. We're going to recruit to the guys that he wants to play this specific style of football that we think is going to work in 2025, 2026. Like, I can see why that happens. And I guess, Mitch, from I've just realized this is more of a Mike's contribution to the debate rather than it is a question. I'm meant to be hosting this. But, but as a fan, when you've seen, essentially failure for your entire life. Sorry to sink the slipper on it, but but it's true. But would you say, okay, I'm willing now to go for this project that accepts that we're not by trying to win it every year, we essentially have not won it any year, and we would like to lean into this sort of thing with an actual plan, kind of like what the Sharks have done with Fitzgibbon is a good example actually, because they've clearly gone, you're going to build this over time in a specific style of football. What Manly I think are trying to do, whether it'll work or not, we don't know. Or to say, press the big Bennett button, and I'm going to throw out, because I know that people will want to hear the view on it, is the worst case scenario that might actually happen is, don't we have a first grade coach who's currently our assistant coach, and give it to T-Baz until the end of the year. So there's your options. You've got project coach from somewhere, you've got Wayne Bennett for next year, or you've got Trent Barrett.
So if it blew up and Brad Arthur was not the coach, which of those three options?
If Brad says tomorrow, I think I've taken this as far as I can, or the coach, he gets the tap on the shoulder and says, look, you were not going to extend your contract. We think you've had enough cracks at this. What sort of coach do you want? The project, the Bennett, or the Barrett?
The Bennett. I know that's the high risk, high reward, but Parramatta is only satisfied with one thing. We're not satisfied with progress. We're satisfied with premierships at this point, and therefore we're not satisfied. So what's going to give us the biggest chance, as Elliot touched on getting that one elusive thing? We don't. Top 4 finishes consistently would be terrific. Building towards something would be amazing. But I think anything, Brad Arthur is too good a coach to swap for another potentially good coach. And I think that our tactics, our players, all of these different areas that we could look at and dissect and pull apart and want different outcomes for, ultimately, if Brad Arthur is not the coach tomorrow, then I think the only reason you do it is to swing for the fences with a Wayne Bennett sort of style. Look, if it gets to the point Wayne Bennett's not available, I'm not suggesting any of the other options are disasters other than potentially Trent Barrett. But look, there's other options that I think could be palatable, but if all of those options are on the table, it has to be Bennett in my mind.
So I think that's an interesting place to sort of to leave it on, because that is coming into this, I would have said that Parramatta were in a strange situation where you have a very known, right? Brad Arthur is he's been there for years. He's not really going to change what he's doing. He's pretty confident that players seem to like him. But there is a point at which you just see, you see the same results over and over and think, well, this is never going to change.
It's not too dissimilar to Canberra and Ricky Stewart, though, who just announced the next 1,000 years of the Ricky Stewart experience down in Canberra. It's a very known experience, and sometimes Ricky Stewart and the way he connects with his players gets them to grand finals, and they almost get over the hump. It's eerily similar. I know that we've been comparing to Manly, and I think in sort of the micro world now, Parra and Manly are quite similar, but when you sort of draw out a little bit, the journeys of Parramatta and Canberra are very, very similar in that regard. And I think that's probably the way that Canberra is running it back with Ricky Stewart. If Parramatta would do the same, it would echo that. It would echo the local legend staying on in his place, who players love, with mixed results. And look, you hope optimistically that it's building towards something, and you blame it on key injuries to Mitch Moses, and you think it would have gone as well as the first 3 rounds of this year would have, and that would have continued throughout the year. And without that key injury, maybe it would have, but at this stage, I think that's the approach, that we don't have the Wayne Bennett aura just yet. We don't have the greatest premiership coach of all time, but we're hoping for better results tomorrow, I think.
It's interesting with the Ricky Stewart comparison, because you'd say if they had gone down that the road they're currently on, and if we were to go down the same one, you'd say they're about a year ahead of us, given the juniors that they've now got playing first grade, through some planning, through some force of just weight of injury. Like I'm pretty sure Ricky said they weren't planning on playing Chevy Stewart much this season, but simply through injury to Jordan Rapana and the inability to actually field another fullback, they had to select him. And we kind of were forced into that with Blaise Talangi as well, having to bring Talangi through at fullback a lot faster than he was supposed to probably be first grade ready. And then you got some slightly older guys, Matt Timokol, Sebastian Chris, Xavier Savage. They're obviously down that pathway a bit more than us. Ethan Strange is getting a full season of NRL under his belt and leading forward back too, though. Yeah, Elliot Whitehead's long in the tooth. They don't really have a hooker that you could say is their nailed on hooker. Like Zach Wolford, I think, is playing reserve grade at the moment. Tom Starling just has never nailed that spot. And yeah, Josh Papali'i is towards the end of his career. Joe Tarpanay, I'm not sure. He must be late 20s.
He's a bit younger than
he's a bit younger.
Yeah, he's not as old as you think.
No, Corey Horsburgh obviously is an Origin caliber player, but he has had some injury troubles lately. They've got Morgan Smithies as well. Hudson Young obviously on the edge.
Yeah, I think saying they're a year ahead of where Parramatta is, but obviously in 2024 is pretty accurate, to be fair. They've got young, established players, and look, we can point to a couple of examples, but they're probably doing that next chapter better than Parramatta is, probably because Parramatta thought 2024 would be more favourable than maybe Canberra. We had higher aspirations, I imagine, for what was realistic for Parramatta's finish this year, and maybe Canberra didn't, and realised that this was that transition that Mike sort of touched on a couple of times. They probably thought they're a year behind us, but now they find themselves a year ahead of us in the rebuild.
Do you think there's something, though, that Canberra also changed the style of play quite a lot to adapt to the way that the NRL is now? And I just wonder, like, one of the things that Ricky Stewart's been best at in his career is having a great assistant who he listens to. Whereas I think Brad's a lot more, I'm not saying he's more headstrong than Ricky, because I don't think it's possible to be more headstrong than Ricky Stewart. But he has been pretty ideologically consistent about how he plays rugby league, which Ricky Stewart really hasn't been. He's been very sort of, I don't know, emotionally consistent. Like, he's always expected the same things. But in terms of how his teams play on the field, he has changed a lot, in the same way Craig Bellamy's changed a lot. Wayne Bennett's changed a lot. Is Brad capable of that, Elliot? In your experience, like, you've watched this team the whole time he's been there, do you think that's something he has in him? Because the way that they play is for rugby league 3 years ago. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. Well, as I've said, he's changed slightly over the years, but it does take him a while to come around to like, I've got to change my style here. So I'll give you an example, is that 2016 team that ended up getting done for being over the cap. He was when the hook was not working in terms of Matt Keating, who'd been there for a while. He was slow. His service was mediocre at best. We needed someone to lead the line speed better. So we went and got Nathan Peets in 2014, 2015. Kieran Foran brought in as the halfback. But then you also start looking at how he started to build that back line out in terms of size and speed. Developed Semi Radradra out of essentially nothing. Who's an incredible talent at rugby 7, but obviously that's a world away from the NRL. Went don't have much in the centres, so I'm going to go get Michael Jennings because we need that power and that strike in the centres. We went and did that. And in terms of like bringing through some young guys, you had speed there of Bevan French, and Clint Gutherson established himself eventually as the fullback in that side. So he kind of brought through has some interesting and smart acquisitions, developed some players, and went, we need to attack more with the back line. They did that for a few years. 2018, that kind of blew up when Semi went over to rugby. Bevan French tore his hamstring and then got dropped. That all fell apart. 2019 went, we need some size in the back line because that's where teams are going. So Blake Ferguson was brought in, Micah Sivo was brought in, Clint Gutherson returned from injury, Michael Jennings was still at the club. So you kind of looked at, well, he kept with that power game, and then it's almost like he moved the other way to adapt, put all the power in the forwards, and the backs got stripped out. So if you look at it, Blake Ferguson released, not really replaced. Michael Jennings suspended, not really replaced. You can kind of count Will Penasini, but he was going to play first grade at some point anyway. He was that talented of a junior. And you look at the slow kind of degradation of that back line and then compare it to Canberra. And Canberra went, and you're right, Ricky Stewart a couple of seasons ago would not have rolled with the type of back line he's got right now, in that it's fast, it's powerful, it's skillful. Ricky was kind of liked his big boys in the middle. He still likes his big boys in the middle, but knows it's important to play to the edges and attack those edges. When you've got Matt Timoko on one side, Sebastian Chris on the other, and then you've got like the speed that side has with Xavier Savage and James Schiller being able to just get at their opponents one-on-one. I just haven't seen that from Brad. And watching them play, like watching the way they defend and watching the way they attack has been the same the past couple of seasons. Defensively, they'll hold their own for the first half an hour or so, or probably get on top of the opponents because they're that big and that physical, and sides don't want to run at them, and they're fresh enough to cover that up. But then on the flip side, you know that when they run the ball, they're going to keep it in the middle of the field. They don't really do dummy half runs. But you watch Parramatta, Clint Gutherson's probably the only back that comes in and takes it from dummy half late in the count. He'll take it as a one pass hit up. And then other than that, he's just they for years will ask a guy to take a one pass hit up into the teeth of the defense and then do that for 4 tackles. And then hand the ball to Mitch and go, please put the ball down the other end of the field and we can defend that because they're away from the try line. But don't ask us to do anything else because once we're under pressure, the defensive structure falls apart. So I think that's a long way to say, basically, he hasn't really changed in 11 years apart from some minor adjustments when either forced into them or the game has moved so far that he's had to adapt. But there's no proactivity from it. There's no going, this is the way the game's developing. We need to find a way to deal with that. And in saying it slowly, I'm sorry, you're going to say something, Mitch. Just 1 second.
I was going to say both those factors you've just touched on are present right now, that he's being forced into, and there's potentially a change in the way in which the game is played away from his current tactics. And look, we could keep going on about, on one hand, Brad's capacity to develop players like Isaiah Papali'i to bring them out of nothing. And you touched on a couple of those in that example that you spoke on of how he's brought a player out of obscurity and made them somewhat superstar status in some respects. But yeah, then there's the flip side that we do need to have that response and that change at the same time. And I guess that's the question mark that hangs over this. Are we responding appropriately? You put your team around players like the power game of Micah Sivo, whose capacity has fallen off a cliff in the last couple of seasons. And you wonder what these little tiny impacts have and how important those cogs are in the overall plan that it would have been. The way in which, certain players have fallen off a cliff or injuries have struck at certain times, but everyone deals with those same sort of ailments and constraints, and Parramatta's at a bit of a crossroad at this stage.
And like the way you just mentioned there, Micah Sivo falling off a cliff is not too dissimilar to what happened when Semi left. So 2017, Parramatta's a top 4 side, surprisingly, but they were a top 4 side. They were incredibly exciting to watch. And surprisingly, at least held their own defensively. But they relied so much on their set start with Semi either fielding the kick and returning the ball well or taking that first hit up and getting the set moving, because they didn't have a huge back line. Like, the fullback was Clint Gutherson and one of the wingers was Bevan French. Neither, particularly at that stage of his career, Clint Gutherson, known for their ability to run the ball back. So Semi gets things going. You had Michael Jennings with dummy half scoot, and you created enough forward momentum there where your smaller backs would get in and pick up those 10 quick meters and get the game rolling. If you look at the way Parramatta structures everything now, they keep looking for Maker to make that 10-meter carry. He just doesn't make it anymore. He doesn't have the leg speed. He doesn't have the drive. He's very upright when he runs. I'm not sure if his just volume of injuries towards the past couple of years has completely removed his ability to go into contact.
I'll just jump in quickly. Bailey Simonson, who's having a pretty terrific season, breaks more tackles than you can poke a stick at, but his running style doesn't create momentum. It actually goes across the line, breaking tackles. He makes good meters. He does his job, but it doesn't create that momentum.
No, and you actually see that because Bailey was a sevens rugby player. That's where you see that movement, that ability to beat a man one-on-one is great in sevens when you go sideways. You beat one guy in sevens, you're through the line. In the NRL, you just have the next guy line you up. And Bailey, to his credit, does a lot of tough work. And so does Will Penasini. Sometimes we'll get monstered by 4 guys and still make post-contact meters. But there's just nothing behind it. There's nothing keeping them going. And even Gutherson this year, I think, has been a bit down on his meters going into contact. And in saying that, as we mentioned, Brad seems to be forced into making changes, or changes are slow. So I see Zach Lomax as a bit of that response. If you look at his numbers, I know he's playing on the wing this year, but he's outperforming every other Parramatta outside back right now across almost every metric in terms of tackle breaks, line breaks, try assists, meters per run, number of runs per game, dummy half runs.
Goals for some reason.
2-point field goals, which is fantastic. Don't mind that. If we want to go up by 2s next year, if it means we're in front, don't care. But having that type of player obviously is helping St. George, even though St. George are still, they've got a lot of other problems in their side. Having that back at least that you can turn to go, he'll pick us up 10 meters a carry, and at least we can start our sets kind of going on the front foot. So to kind of
I'm just thinking here, there is a comparison there because Ravalava is a very similar player, not just because they're both Fijian, but he is a similar player to Sivo in that you would think he'd be better at yardage than he is, put it that way. And I think you can see that in the way, I know St. George is one of the most imbalanced teams in the league. Like, they play to Lomax way more often than they play to the other side of the field.
And even when they're on the other side of the field, Lomax is on the other side of the field too.
Yeah, he'll move across.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that maybe we can end on an optimistic note, which is that if you look, you mentioned before that 1 to 7 for next year, if you throw in him, Simonson's pretty good, I think. Sean Russell's pretty capable backup. I'm not sure I'd want him to be my first guy, but he's not a bad second guy. You're then going to have Simonson, Penasini, Gutho, obviously. Lomax probably plays centre and Sivo, and then suddenly you remove that element from Sivo and you give it to Lomax. I can see that being a good, this is a good team. There is, if you put that team to Wayne Bennett, you could see that team winning the premiership. Is that, I'd say the weakness would maintain being Lussick, probably. Then you've got Matt Arthur, suddenly he could be a bench option. You've got all these different. I might end on a positive note from Parramatta fan. I know this doesn't come naturally to you, but hit me with your most positive take.
Lussick is an interesting one to point out there. I've always thought Parramatta runs best when they've got 2 hookers. I actually think we'd see better from Lussick if he was actually getting minutes shared with Hands. I think you see the best of both of them. So if I saw that going into the future, I'd be happy with your hooker rotation, particularly if Matt Arthur was involved there. If he comes through, continues to come through like he has, and you go, he's your long-term hooker, Joey Lussick, you've kind of done your job here, you can move on, and Matt's going to move on to the bench and Hands is into the starting side. You're right, that kind of 1 to 7 looks pretty positive moving into next season. In terms of how you balance that is a bit up in the air. Sean Russell's been pretty solid. He looked all right in the centres against Brisbane. Bailey Simonson is an NRL player, I'd say now. His kind of versatility is a big bonus for him, playing in the centres and playing on the wing. I know he's filled in at fullback for Canberra, I think, in a preliminary final as well when he's been asked to. In terms of the issues in the forward pack, if Wayne Bennett is your coach, kind of similar to the way he's run the Dolphins, and hell, the way he ran Brisbane's last premiership side as well, with a couple of aging props in the middle of the field and a makeshift hooker. He's got experience in knowing how to get the best out of those players. And I've heard Wayne's basically told him, we only need you for 20 minutes this week or 25 minutes, and that's all we need because you just need to do your job. Like that type of understanding how to use those resources that you've got. If Brad's still there next year, I'm going to accept that they are looking to bring through that next group, which is exciting to say the least, given that SG ball side from last year would be coming through into grade, and you might be able to see some of the juniors that they put the work into over the last 3 years. Although, Mitch, you've probably got a bit more of that understanding of our juniors, given you work with John 4020, who gets out to a lot of the junior games.
Yeah, I think we're not as covered in the forwards as I'd like to think we are. Look, there's a couple of options, but to be honest, there's a couple of people, and I won't name names, but maybe they thought they would kick on a bit stronger than they have after that SG Ball premiership. And so it's funny to go from what I would, Parramatta's forward pack 18 months ago had been a conversation of the best forward pack in the NRL to, gee, we've got a major crisis in regards to forwards. I wonder, it's potentially, and you asked me to be optimistic, wishful thinking, that the difference of a Mitch Moses kicking game makes to and reactivates this forward, because we actually looked, I thought, pretty good. I thought we went toe-to-toe with Penrith in round 2. And I know we keep going back to this magical time where we're averaging 24 points with Mitch Moses. We're in the 7, but earlier this year, you just wonder, winning cures or ills. And I wonder if you get a couple of wins on the board and you start to think maybe this forward pack's not on its last legs, but ultimately you've got to start thinking at 25 and 26. And I think we've got a couple of gaps, and we'll probably need to be either shipping some players on, which, we've had the capacity to do so this year and previous years, and potentially be buying in those areas. I think that'll be Parramatta's 25 and 26 off season, because like I said, I think 1 through 7 we're pretty well managed now with a going forward with a plan.
It'd be interesting if you went back to 2020, 2021, when we released that huge chunk of forwards. I think we released like 4 forwards in one off season, 4 NRL players. I think it was like Oregon Kafusi, Tepai Mauroa, Ray Stone, and Murata Nyakore, all in like an 18-month period. And I know Murata went over to New Zealand to go home, and Isaiah Papali'i as well. Is if you had to ask Brad, knowing what he knows now, would they have released Oregon to go play for Cronulla? Would they have released Ray Stone to go to the Dolphins? And look, there's 2 sides to that, in that we might have wanted to keep them, but they saw more first grade elsewhere. But also in saying that, looking the way they're performing now and the clear weaknesses that we've discussed, would a different decision have been taken a few years ago? And have they learned from those decisions as well, in terms of developing and putting the time into Luca Moretti and Wuramu Greg as well? Because they put the time into Oregon and Ray, and both of them ended up out of the club by the end of it.
Yeah, for what it's worth, both Luca and Wiramu, and we don't know what their future holds, but both of them looked like prime candidates to bring across and to do exactly what they thought they would do. Luca, a star in rugby, and looked pretty good in the Roosters juniors, if I remember correctly. And Wiramu, I think he came from North Queensland, and they were pretty filthy to have lost him. So, like, that looks like the right play at the time when they were grabbed. And whether or not they need more NRL time, they need a different approach to training, and they need sort of management of where to, or maybe even more minutes on the field. But that looked like what needed to be done in order to bridge this gap to 25 and 26. But I guess time will tell.
Because I'm thinking of what I wrote at the time, and it's like, if you'd have said, would you rather have Bryce Cartwright or Isaiah Papali'i, it's a pretty easy question in 2021. But the end of 2022. But I'd say now, I think I'd rather have Bryce Cartwright. So he has proven that he can get these guys up to a level. I don't think anyone looks at the back row and goes, I'd rather have Isaiah Papali'i than Bryce Cartwright or Jermaine Hopgood. Like, those guys look really good. Like, he has proven that particular part of the game is something where you can make sort of a guy who was playing mostly New South Wales Cup for Penrith into a guy who, in 2 weeks' time could get picked for Queensland, like in Hopgood, for example. So,
although Jermaine was only playing reserve grade because Isaac Yeo was a lock.
That's a good point.
He did win New South Wales Cup Player of the Year. I think any other club, he's a starting NRL player that season.
Yeah,
but you're right.
But Cartwright was nothing. Cartwright,
No,
he
he
the only
was
thing he could get
busted,
a
he was
game at
gone.
was Parramatta.
Oh, even what he did to Papali'i. Brought Papali'i
Yeah.
from a bare reserve grade. I don't think he was even on the bench for the Warriors when we brought him across, and he went to premier second rower in the competition. Did he win it of the year? If he didn't, he should have.
I think he did. Yeah, he did. He did. I'd still take Isaiah, but it's not for the reason that you're thinking. And this is actually when we signed him, I was more excited about the fact that he played middle than the fact that he could play on edge. And it's what we've discussed here, that lack of that middle forward who carries the ball well but defends very aggressively.
With lateral movement.
With good lateral movement, but his ability to play on the edge and in the middle. And he only turned into an edge player at Parramatta because of injury, because Ryan Madison got knocked out by Felice Kafusi, I think, with that elbow to the to the head, which knocked him out for 6 weeks. Isaiah got pushed there because we had injuries in the centres, and Marata Nukore turned into the best defensive centre in the NRL for about 8 weeks. And you had Papali'i being forced to play him on an edge because he was coming off the bench and playing in the middle until that point.
Yeah, he started off the bench for us in a 15.
So I'd still take Ice, but only because we got problems in the middle forwards, but not because he could play on the edge in place of Bryce Cartwright. I think that ability to have Bryce and the fact we've also missed him for a few weeks, he doesn't change, I think, a lot of those results, but just having that point of difference that Bryce can create something from nothing would have been nice. And I will
just throw in it's an interesting shift from Ryan Madison this year. He's now a full-time middle forward. He's the replacement for RCG. When he comes on, Ryan Madison plays that prop position, and I dare suggest this is the first time he's played that sort of middle. I know he's played lock previously, but he's never played an 8 or a 10 role. So that's another shift in the way that Brad's using the forward spot.
Well, there you go. Brad Arthur remains the forward whisperer, and I think we've ended this podcast by saying 4 more years, so he can do the same again as he's replaced all everyone he's left without missing them for 1 second. I'm conscious this is now a very long podcast, but I could talk. I know you boys love talking about Parramatta, and I love listening to it. So I hope people listen to that too. Go and read the Cumberland Throw. I read it all the time. Every time I want to know something about Parramatta, it's really good. And One Eyed Eel, Extended Bench, Rugby League Monthly, all of the many projects for Elliot Richardson are always worth engaging with. The Game Plan Pandemic, I was watching your YouTube videos as well, so keep them going. And I don't know what you say. Could Parramatta get rid of their countdown music? That's what I'd like. And also, when it's a sellout, could you actually show up? There's my 2 pet hates of working Parramatta Gate. The Parramatta sellout that is never been a sellout. I'll leave you on this. First game of the season against the Bulldogs, my dad was here, and one of his mates, the great Aaron Sawyer, scorer of the last try at Rochdale Hornets old ground. He's a Parramatta supporter. I had to pull strings to get them tickets because it was a sellout, and when they turned up, they said, "Where's everybody else?" So, because
it was the Bulldogs fans who didn't show up, obviously.
I blame the Bulldogs. But on that note, I'll say thanks so much for your time. As ever, like, subscribe, and leave reviews. Love to read reviews. So, lads, have a great evening and go Parramatta. That was really bad as a Manly fan.
Go the Eels.
Go the Eels.